There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
The following episode contains discussions of violence and the retelling of traumatic events. Listener discretion is advised.
It's lunchtime on a cool Sunday in April, and the Port Arthur historic site is buzzing with visitors. Located at the southern tip of the Tasman Peninsula, Port Arthur is located about 100 kilometres southeast of Hobart, the capital of Tasmania. The quaint village was once a penal settlement and a main drawcard for tourists visiting Australia's southernmost state. At around 1:10 p.m, a man named Martin Bryant pays his entry fee for the Port Arthur site and parks near the Broad Arrow Cafe. He sits in his car for a few minutes. He is seen walking towards the cafe with a sports bag and a video camera. He orders lunch, which he eats on the outside deck. To onlookers, he looks slightly nervous, but otherwise like a normal man. Likely just another tourist visiting Port Arthur. That morning, Bryant had awoken at 6 a.m, which was unusually early for him. He left his home at 9:47 a.m. and drove to Fawcett, arriving around 11 a.m. Then he continued on to Port Arthur, where he stopped at an accommodation site in Seascape. He hated the owners, David and Nolene Martin, who had bought the property before Bryant's father had been able to. His father, Maurice Bryant, had been devastated and years later had ended his own life. Bryant blamed the Martins for his father's death. When he arrived at Seaside, he fired several shots, killing Nolene Martin and then stabbing David Martin. He then continued to Port Arthur with a lightweight semi-automatic rifle. What followed was the worst massacre in Australian history committed by a single person. 35 people were killed and 23 were left wounded. I'm Jessie Stevens and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Anita Bingham, who was working as a waitress at Port Arthur Historic Site's Francis Langford Tea Rooms on the day of the massacre. Anita, what do you remember about the morning of April 28, 1996?
Well, I remember going to work as per usual that morning, and it was a nice day. It was like an autumn, crisp, cool morning, and I was working in, it's like a little cottage called the Francis Langford Tea Rooms. And my role there is a waitress, so I would be serving tea and coffee and scones and lunch to customers.
You were 17 at the time. What did your life look like? Were you working this job while finishing off high school, or had you finished high school?
I had finished high school. I didn't go to college, so I went straight into waitressing when I was 15. My parents had a holiday, I guess you call it a shack, down on the Tasman Peninsula, and they moved there permanently. So once I finished school in Hobart, I went down to live with them for a while. So I was 17, at the time.
Had you been working at this cafe long?
Not really, no. Might have only been like a month. Yeah, it was all quite new.
And for anyone who hasn't been to Port Arthur, can you describe what it is and why people visit and the setup in terms of there being cafes and stuff for visitors?
Well, Port Arthur Historic Site is actually a place where convicts once were sent there back in the 18th century. So it was a settlement for people who committed crime. People got shipped out from the UK and, sent to prison for minor crime, for stealing a loaf of bread or a handkerchief or something. So it was operational for quite a long time. and then it eventually seized, and it's now like an historical site to go and visit. So there's lots of old buildings with bars still on the windows. It's been really well restored over time. Conservation have gone in to protect the buildings from collapsing, and it's now the popular tourist destination for visitors to Tasmania. So it's a World Heritage listed place, and yeah, so it's a huge site. It's a massive amount of land, and lots of old buildings are still standing. And people who go would go for the day, bring a picnic, sit in the gardens under a tree, stroll around the land, or you could go to a cafe and have lunch. There were 2 cafes on site.
That day, what was your first inclination that something was wrong?
I vividly remember serving a bowl of soup to a couple. They were sitting on a table for 2. So as I was putting the soup down, I heard the first bang. It was a really loud bang. And then another, and then another. And then my first actual reaction was, oh, there must be a reenactment. Because I hadn't been there for very long working, I was still getting to know the place. And I actually thought there were people dressed up outside with muskets. I thought there was going to be a show on. So I went outside. Yeah, I remember walking out the front of the cottage and walking towards the sounds. And the more I heard, I thought, oh, something's not right. And when I knew something wasn't right was also when I could see people ducking behind walls of the buildings on the site. But it was quite a distance from me. I mean, I'm talking so many metres away. I could hear it, but I couldn't quite see exactly what was going on. I could just see some people running in the distance and ducking down, hiding behind walls.
And where were they running from? Were they running from the other cafe on site?
Yeah, the other cafe on site, yeah.
And once you recognised that something was very wrong, what was your instinct? What did you do?
My instinct was, oh, something's just not quite right here. So I remember going back inside. Everyone sort of heard it as well, so we're all a bit curious about what was going on. It was really unclear too, so it was really difficult to know what to do. But as time unfolded, I just remember we thought it was best to keep people inside the cottage, and we kept the doors locked. And I remember having to just reassure people that things are okay, remain seated. It was just such a long day. And I just remember making customers tea and coffee and water because we had to stay inside for quite a while until we kind of had some clear communication as to what was going on. I think we may have had a phone call at the cafe, I'm not sure, or another staff member might have ran over and knocked on the door and told us what was going on, or, yeah.
What happened in the minutes and hours after you heard those gunshots?
So as time went by, I actually remember my boss and one of the boys that was working in the bakery at the cafe, they started to run over to the Broad Arrow where the shootings occurred and started helping them by running lots of urns of tea and coffee, water, whatever they could find to help people. I think the customers were slowly let out. Maybe once we had the all clear that he wasn't on the site. It was a weird time. It was a really weird moment because I remember my boss was saying, oh, you know, just clean up as per usual. And I remember once the customers had left the cottage, my job was to vacuum clean as per usual. But I remember vacuuming, but I was just so terrified because we still really didn't know where he was. And I was in there by myself for a while, vacuuming this cottage out, and I kept looking over my shoulder all the time because I was just like, where is this guy? And I was so scared.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stevens. I'm speaking with Anita Bingham, a waitress at the Port Arthur Historic Site who was working on the day of the massacre. Can you remember when you heard what had actually taken place that day and how that felt to learn of the tragedy that had occurred around you?
Yeah, well, I actually remember giving my sister a phone call, actually. And I remember just picking up the phone and calling her and going, hey, what the hell's going on down here? This is crazy. And my sister said, oh, okay, that's why I can see ambulances and police cars screaming past. So she kind of wasn't sure either. So I remember talking to her, and then I wasn't allowed to go home until dark. I remember we all had to kind of stay on the site until police and so forth gave the instructions it was safe to leave the property. And I vividly remember going up to the local pub up on the hill, the Port Arthur Motor Inn, and my dad was waiting for me there at the bar. And I just remember running to him, and he grabbed me so tight, and I hugged him so tight. And it was just like, oh, because my dad didn't know whether I was okay or not while all this was going on. And it was just that safety of, oh, I'm in my dad's arms, and it was a bit of a sense of relief. But it really wasn't until I got home that night, sat down, put on the news, and the news flashed in front of my eyes with everything like the cars being stopped on the highway, the police blocking off the highway. That's when it really sunk in and hit me. What the hell just happened then? Because it did feel so surreal. It didn't feel real.
Well, it was the most deadly shooting in Australian history, and you were metres away. That would have just been so terrifying. And you would have learned in the days afterwards that I think it was 35 victims, which just would have been so beyond traumatic. In the days afterwards, were you haunted by those thoughts of, that could have been me?
Oh, God, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember going to bed that night. I don't remember sleeping well. And I think the next few nights I actually had a dream of him running after me with the gun, hunting me down. So that was a really horrible nightmare. And, yeah, I remember getting some brief counselling at the local SES headquarters or whatever it is in a little shed because it's a local country town and it's so isolated down there. When I just sort of skipping back, I remember it felt like forever before police or ambulance or the helicopters all arrived to the site. Maybe the local doctors were there on the scene as quick as they could, but yeah. So anyway, the days after, I just felt so lucky to be here, to be alive, and I wasn't the one over in the Broad Arrow. But ironically, when I applied for work at the historic site, they were going to put me in the Broad Arrow, actually. There was a position going there, but I ended up at the tea rooms, thankfully.
Oh, my God.
So, yeah, I was really numb after it all. It was just so surreal thing, like you just couldn't believe it. And I couldn't read any media. I found it hard to read any sort of newspapers or watch the news and things like that. It was quite hard to take in.
And I can imagine it would have been everywhere because of
the
scale. And in the days, weeks and even now, I mean, the name Martin Bryant is infamous in Australia. Did you learn much about him and who he was afterwards, or have you just completely shut that out?
Yeah, I just completely shut it out. I didn't want to know. I mean, you do ask why. Why on earth would someone do such a terrible thing, especially those little girls, especially I feel for Walter Mikak, losing his two little daughters. Oh, God, it breaks my heart. And it wasn't just people that, I guess, even though people died, it's the scars that you live with afterwards is still just as painful. The damage he's done to people just from, you've got to live with those memories and they're hard to just switch off. So I really did shut a lot of stuff out about him. But I think the 20th anniversary was when I just started to really be more intrigued by what happened that day. And I was interviewed once by an author called Margaret Scott. She wrote a book called Port Arthur, A Story of Courage and Strength. Mm-hmm. And I've got about a 2-page section where I've told my story and then the book's filled with other people's stories. But I've not been able to really sit down and actually read that book from front to back. So I actually did do that not long ago. I pulled it out of the box at home and I read it. And I was also given a bravery award by the governor. And I sometimes think, I don't know why I was given this, but I guess I helped people in a way.
Of course. And I think when people talk about something traumatic happening or a moment of crisis, they say we go into fight or flight or freeze. And it sounds like you kept going, which is not necessarily what, I might have done or anyone else.
Yeah, your adrenaline kind of kicks in and you just go, oh, my God, you've just got to yeah, I just wanted to help people. And I think going back to your question, afterwards too, I did find it really difficult going to a cafe anywhere or public places. I just wanted to sit where I could see the door. I remember I just had to, and I still do that sometimes, which is really odd, but I need to know who's coming and going from the cafe. And yeah, I get a little bit spooked if I know someone's walking in with a big bag, because that's kind of what happened.
This is a strange question, but I'm wondering if when the Sydney siege events happened, if that was at all triggering for you because of the sight.
Yeah, it did a bit. And I did watch that, I think, on Four Corners or something one night. And, oh, gosh, I probably shouldn't have, because it really triggered some things, and I felt for those people as well.
Because it would deprive your sense of safety that you have in an environment that's meant to be really safe. And if you can't relax, then, you know, you must be on such high alert.
Yeah. I'm not too bad now, but you're just fully aware of it. And anything that goes bang, oh my gosh, I jump at the sound of a car backfiring, a balloon popping. I had trouble not long after. My friends and I, we went to the regatta and there were fireworks, and it just triggered stuff for me again. And I had to kind of, luckily my friend was understanding, but I just needed to get away for a bit.
Have you had any contact, other than that book, with any other survivors in the 25 years since?
Yeah, I have, but not so much a regular contact or anything. Like, there's another guy that I know who was working on the ferry at the time, and he was there that day, but he hasn't really spoken to me a lot about his experience. I don't think he really likes talking about it much. And another guy who I was working with. But, some people just don't want to talk about it, which is fine. But, as I said, after it was really a hard time too, because I remember being not new to the community, but I sort of was. I was only 17. I actually felt quite alone in a weird way too, as much as the community was affected, and some people were directly affected, some were indirectly affected. And I know that some businesses went broke and things like that because of it. But thankfully, they got us some counselling, and I worked with a lady for a number of years, and she was really good at helping me.
Our understanding of trauma and PTSD has come so far since 1996, and you must have really felt that, because I imagine in the aftermath there wouldn't have been nearly as much understanding or potentially compassion, because they're thinking, well, you weren't physically harmed, but the what ifs that would have played through your mind, I just can't imagine.
Oh, no, that's right.
Have you been back to the site since?
Oh, yeah, many times, yeah. So after that actual day, I remember going away for about 2 or 3 weeks holiday. I'm pretty sure my doctor suggested I take some time off. And then when I came back to work, it was a really weird time, because I remember coming back and my position was no longer available. So they put me in the Broad Arrow Cafe. So it was like a temporary setup, because the cafe had been kind of wrecked, but there was like a temporary building, because they still needed to try and get business up and running again. And I remember just washing pots in the Broad Arrow, and I didn't really like that. I felt really uncomfortable. So, I did go back, and then many years later, I think I went travelling, and then I came back, because where I live in that town, there's not a lot of employment. So Port Arthur is really the drawcard for employment for a lot of the locals.
Right.
And so I went back. I've been back about 3 times, and my most recent time would have only been about a year ago, and I worked as a ticketing officer on the counter, and I really loved that, because I do love people. I love tourism. I love visitors, and I get excited about them coming to see Tassie, because it's such a beautiful place. And I really enjoyed it. But again, what I found difficult was I was standing at the door. That was one of my roles, and it was to meet and greet customers as they were coming through the door, give them a brochure, tell them about the tours on offer and what tickets do they want to purchase. But some people will just walk in the door and they're just curious about where the shooting happened, and they're not interested in coming to buy a ticket. Some will just walk in and go, "Oh, can you tell me where that crazy man just went and killed everyone? Is it where I'm standing now? Was it there? Was it there?" And
oh my God.
And I'm just like, whoa, like my whole body just goes into this. Like I sort of freeze, and then I start sweating, and they don't know I was there that day, So Yeah, my physical symptoms started to just go really oof, and then I had to take a deep breath and kind of explain, because we're given brochures now that explains what happened that day. So I just have to direct them to that, and there's a memorial garden you can go down and pay a visit to. But I found it hard. Nearly on a daily basis, someone will mention the shooting, and I couldn't do it anymore. I just had to leave.
No, I completely understand that.
Yeah.
And finally, I just wanted to ask, in terms of the long-term effects of Port Arthur and what happened that day, I've read a lot about post-traumatic growth, and that sometimes having an instance like this, it can bring about positive psychological change from these sorts of adverse circumstances. Is that something you relate with at all?
Oh, definitely. Oh, yeah. I really learned a lot from that day. And what I learned most of all was life is just so short. Gosh, 1 minute you're here, next you're not. And I just was like, oh my God, I was so close to that possibly happening to me that day. And I just went, man, I remember just being in the counsellor's chair, 17, and I had a bucket list of stuff. I'm like, right, I want to do this, I want to do that. And I just wanted to live life to the fullest. And I did. I went around Australia in a camper van when I was 21, and then I took off overseas and travelled the world many times now. And it's made me live in the moment. And I've still got a really dislike to guns. I struggle watching any kind of violent films for shooting. I still get frustrated when I hear America's got shootings going on and that. But it just made me want to live life to the fullest, and that's something that's changed my perspective, yeah.
That's something it seems like some victims of crime relate with. And if there's one other thing we can be somewhat thankful for from Port Arthur, it's the changing gun laws, and that a mass shooting like this has not happened again, and hopefully will never happen again in this country.
Yeah, hopefully. I think good on to John Howard. He got quite onto it straight after those gun laws. But, I mean, they're still around, and there's still controversy. I've heard of all different sides of the story. I've heard, farmers need guns for animals and that, and I get that, but it's just when they end up in the wrong hands, really. And, and I always wonder why, what went through his mind that day. And I've heard lots of different things like, but, he was bullied and he had Asperger's or whatever illness he may have had. I don't know, but I sort of don't want to know in a way either. But, you just can't understand why someone could do such an evil thing.
Anita Bingham was awarded a Bravery Medal by the Governor-General for her efforts on the day of the Port Arthur massacre. She also has a letter from the Queen commending her efforts. This year marks 25 years since the traumatic events of April 28, 1996, but they live on in the memories of survivors and the Australian public. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Sound design is by Ian Camilleri, and our producer is Gia Moylan. If you'd like to find out more about the show, don't forget to join our online community. Just search for True Crime Conversations on Facebook and make a request to join. If you want more true crime, then check out this month's Spill Watch Club. It tells the story behind Stan's compelling new true crime series called Manhunt: Deadly Games, based on the true events of the deadly terrorist attack at the 1996 Atlanta Olympic Games that resulted in one of the biggest manhunts in US history. You can listen by searching The Spill in your favourite podcast app.